Good morning. I'm Greg Munro. I'm the Interim Dean of the Law School. I welcome each of you to this commemoration of our great friend and mentor, Professor William F. Duke Crowley. One of the measures of success in your life, I think, is what impact you've had on others, what meaningful role you've played in their lives. Our presence here this morning is a reflection of the great success of Duke Crowley's life as a public servant in the state of Montana. Duke was a key figure in and keen observer of Montana politics, government, the legal profession, and the law school. To our great fortune, he was also by nature a historian and, as you know, a master storyteller who provided us a colorful recounting of the development of these institutions. Each person in this room this morning has stories that would say so much about Duke Crowley. The six of us who have been selected to tell bits of his history consider ourselves lucky and hope this morning to do justice to the memory of our friend who was mentor to so many students. One September morning, 42 years ago, I and 74 classmates awaited our first meeting with this Professor Crowley, whose reputation induced anxiety in freshman law students starting criminal law. At precisely 8 a.m., impeccably dressed in a dark suit, white shirt and tie, the stern, unsmiling, and ramrod-stiff source of our fear arrived at the podium. Without ceremony, he began what would be a year-long interweaving of the 1,000 stories that culminated in Montana criminal law. Stories about English burglars, stories about the kings and queens bench courts, stories about American rapists convicted, murderers acquitted, elements of arson in Montana, legislative machinations, hanging judges, Butte politics, Helena politics, Montana state prisons and jails. Stories about the codification of Montana criminal law, in which he played such a key part. This was all punctuated by what came to be known as Dukeisms or Crowleyisms, punchlines delivered in a deadpan manner that made them hilarious and left the class rolling with laughter while we scribbled them in our notes. In time, we realized that every word and every Dukeism had a purpose and a relevance in his own course outline from which he taught, and that outline was impeccable in its structure as the suit he wore. We loved the class, thought ourselves most knowledgeable in criminal law, and accepted the fact that our stern master's standard grade was a C. Could any other professional command the attention and respect he still enjoys among his students of 4 decades? Many people sent in Crowleyisms in the last 6 months, and so I'll intersperse some of those this morning. Most of us remember his most famous line when he would finish the story of a felon who was convicted. He would say, "They put him so deeply in prison that they had to shoot sunshine into him with a cannon." He loved Montana, spoke often of different, and he loved talking about the cases in different areas. He said of Great Falls, "Ah, yes, Great Falls, the only city I know where you can walk around the block and have the wind hit you square in the face every time you turn the corner." He didn't have much patience with experts, especially psychological or psychiatric experts. He said, "I think a psychologist should be allowed to testify as an expert, as long as he wears a conical hat along the witness stand with signs of the zodiac on it." Or he'd also compare and say, or you could go to Nevada, where there is no law. Our favorite crime that I think he invented was mopery with intent to gawk. Evan Barrett is the Director of Business and Community Outreach for Highlands College in Butte. He has spent the last 44 years at the top level of Montana economic development in Montana. He is the most senior living staff member who worked under Duke when Duke led the reorganization of the executive branch of Montana government in the 1960s. Evan speaks here today of the man he identifies as a major mentor in his life. Evan?
Thanks, Greg, and it's good to see all of you here. I'm not an attorney, but I'm not uncomfortable here. I have 3 brothers who are attorneys, but instead of law school, I ended up in graduate school here back in 1967. And after a year of graduate school and 1 year of teaching in the Helena school system, Almost exactly 45 years ago, in fact, in August of 1969, at the age of 24, I walked into the offices of Governor Forrest Anderson's Executive Reorganization Project. In that tiny fourth-floor room in the state capitol were two gentlemen with whom you are all familiar, George Bosleman, who would later head up the Montana Bar for many, many years, and Duke Crowley, the boss, Forrest Anderson's guy in this important project that changed Montana. And while I didn't get a law degree, I often felt like I got the equivalent of a law degree by working with Duke, but also by sitting hour after hour with Duke as he held forth at a corner table in a Helena bar called Room 35. Duke was 22 years my senior, and I learned so much from him just listening, but I guess that's what you did when you were here too. He was born in Walkerville, just up the hill from historic Uptown Butte, and his was a working class upbringing, experiencing tough work and terrible strikes of union workers against the company. He lived near the Lexington Mine, that's right at the top of Main Street, on a street he once said had the grand name of Lexington Terrace, which he said was really just a series of 7 houses faced up against the mine fence. Duke's first stint in government was as an assistant to Attorney General Arnold Olson, brother of his good friend, Butte friend, and fellow attorney Paul Olson. Duke always respected the value of friendships. When Arnold ran unsuccessfully for governor in 1956, Duke thought he would be gone, but he was asked to stay on in 57 as a chief assistant by incoming Attorney General Forrest Anderson, who was leaving the Supreme Court. But after a full term with Forrest, Duke joined his friend Tom Hanrahan in the Lewis and Clark County Attorney's Office. Despite being born in Butte and all the years he spent in Missoula, Duke indicated later in life that the place he really loved was Helena. He said, quote, "It was something about state government." His big mark was working with Forrest Anderson in reorganizing the state government of Montana, a reshaping that has held for the last 43 years now. And I noticed that it speaks in the little booklet, leaflet, about taking 120 agencies and making them into 20. It was really closer to 200 boards, bureaus, and commissions independently operating from the governor that were shaped into the modern government that we have today by Forrest and Duke working together. After landing here at the law school, Duke was called back by his old friend Forrest Anderson and his old boss in early '69 to help with this project and other things, working part-time mostly on weekends, summers, and during school breaks. Over and above executive reorganization, I want to mention quickly 3 specific things that speak to the nature of the Duke. One relating to Montana's Constitution, one relating to the sales tax, and one relating to Butte. You know, the sales tax was the biggest political issue in Montana in the 1960s until it was killed in the electorate in November of '71 referendum. At that time, as a young executive, by then I'd become a young executive director of the Democratic Party, I became de facto kind of one of the leaders in fighting against the sales tax. On Columbus Day of 1971, just before the special election, everyone was wondering how to establish that the Anaconda Company and other corporate giants were behind the sales tax. While all the state and local employees were enjoying the holiday, a small group of us were sitting around the AFL-CIO offices chatting. That included Duke Crowley and included my friend Gordon Bennett. I remember saying how good it would be if we could somehow get a look at the books of the sales tax group and find out who's providing that financial support. Out of the blue, Duke looks up and says, "I believe there's a provision in the 1912 Corrupt Practices Act that says that the treasurer of a political committee must make their books available to the treasurer of the competing political committee." If that isn't pure Duke, I don't know what is. He and Gordon went off and found a volume of the old RCM, and sure enough, there was the provision, which over the ensuing 2 months led to this dismantling of the sales tax apparatus and its political demise. Duke knew his law, and Duke knew politics. As to the new Montana Constitution, when it was finally put to a vote, it passed by only 2,500 votes. Opponents were prepared to, and in fact did, go to the Montana Supreme Court and to quash the vote on a technical basis. Governor Anderson and Duke were both supporters of the Constitution and opponents of the vested interests who wanted to kill it. Those interests wanted to enjoin the governor from certifying the electoral win after the vote, the count had become final. Sniffing this out, the governor and Duke prepared the paperwork for the certification on the east end of the second floor, and it was just waiting for the numbers to be inserted so the governor could immediately sign it. When Secretary of State Frank Murray, who by the way was an opponent of the Constitution, revealed the numbers to the Board of Examiners, which included Forrest Anderson, the governor took the numbers, handed them to Duke, who scurried down the hallway, had them inserted in the paperwork, hand-delivered immediately back to the governor in minutes, the paperwork, and he signed the certification, catching the opponents flat-footed. The constitutional election would be ultimately prevail in Montana court, but that was the kind of thing that was the evidence of the kind of Duke we knew. He's both politically astute and definitely street savvy. Finally, Duke always had those working class, union, democratic roots in Butte that colored his thinking about government and his approach to life. Having lived in Butte now 35 years, I have a renewed appreciation for what Duke was getting at in one of his favorite stories, which he told to me many times over. You've probably all heard it. But Duke said that as we graduate young attorneys, they walk out through portals over which are inscribed some classic words like equal justice under the law. Duke would say, now that's a nice sentiment. But it's not really practical advice for emerging young attorneys. Something more helpful should be above those portals. Over the first portal, it should read, your client's going to lie to you. Over the second portal, it should say, never trust an accountant. And reflecting the true nature of Duke, the son of Butte and Walkerville, over the third portal, it should read, there's a guy in Butte that needs a job. That's the Duke Crowley I remember and will always miss. And let me take 30 more seconds to tell you the last time I saw Duke. My wife and I came over here, we were at St. Pat's, and the elevator came down. The doors opened and there was Duke. So I grabbed my wife, who'd never met Duke before, and I said, Gail, you've got to meet Duke Crowley, a great mentor of mine. And the door started to close, and he looked up and he said, don't blame me. Anyway, it's a pleasure to be here to try to give some recognition to what a terrific mentor for me in my life, not just my work life, but my personal life, and I'm sure for all of you as well. Thanks very much.
Professor Crowley started his law school career on an all-male and very formal faculty that included renowned professors Eddie Briggs, David Mason, and Dean Robert Sullivan. As his retirement from full-time teaching approached in 1990, the faculty chose as his successor an irrepressible, outdoorsy young female lawyer named Inky, who graduated from Dartmouth and Cornell and hailed from large firm practice in Billings and Seattle. He was in awe. Professor Cynthia Ford.
So not for want of trying, I did not get to attend this fine law school. In fact, I imagine that in 1976, Duke Crowley might have consulted, 1976, Duke might have consulted with Dean Bob Sullivan about the application to transfer from Cornell Law School to Montana from a girl from Connecticut. And I also imagine that Duke probably concurred in the dean's rejection of that application. So in the end, I did graduate from Cornell. I had a great and very famous professor of evidence, but I did not get to have Duke. I did get to Montana right after law school, and I was blessed to have some terrific mentors in practice at the Crowley firm in Billings. And at that Crowley firm, way over there on the other side of the state, I heard a lot about the other Duke, the non-Kale, or the other Crowley, the non-Kale, the Duke Crowley over here, way over here at the law school in Missoula. I myself did not get to meet Professor Crowley until 1990, when I did join the faculty to teach civil procedure. Upon his partial retirement, even after I took over the first year required course in civil procedure, he continued to teach criminal law for several years until Melissa Harrison came and took that over. And just between us, two girls still didn't fill up the entire caseload of the Duke. Eventually, he continued with evidence, and then I took that over. As the way of law schools was then and still now, when I was hired to teach here, I had not taught a single moment in my life of any subject to any person, including any CLE. So I was not sure that I could, and I was not sure that I wanted to teach. I told my clients that they should not get another lawyer for 9 months. I might be back in June. And but for Duke, I probably would have abandoned this whole thing and gone back to private practice. This is what happened with Duke. My first day at law school, which was in August of 1990, my first visitor was another professor, Rob Nadelson. He came to my office. He looked me up and down, and then he pronounced that I was appropriately dressed. I had been getting myself ready for court and the office for 12 years, and of course I was wearing my pearls because I'm Duke. Duke came shortly after that. Maybe he heard that exchange because his office was next door. When Duke came in, he handed me the Bible of teaching civil procedure, which was the casebook he himself had prepared and assiduously updated every single year. And that is the book that I used to teach civil procedure for 15 years until I was on leave 1 year and a colleague took the course over and moved to a national casebook. Duke rejected the national casebook approach because he felt that it did not appropriately teach Montana lawyers to be what Montana law was. He certainly observed and taught federal law, but his book incorporated both federal cases and other federal materials, and then cases illustrating the Montana treatment of those federal rules and where they differ, which I'll talk about in a minute. On that first day, he gave me the book, and then he set about teaching me how to teach. I remember saying to him, I don't think I know enough to teach. And he gave me the single best piece of teaching advice I've ever had, in which I try to pass on. You may not know much, but you know more than they do. As the semester went on, that semester and all the other ones which followed, where we were colleagues, Duke gave me frequent and very useful advice on how to deal with classrooms, how to deal with more challenging students, and there are some of those, how to craft an exam, and then how to grade an exam. My office, as I said, was right next to Duke's, down at the very end of Faculty Row in the old wing. He would be astounded by this room. I know he saw it, but he never did teach in here. Duke was like a clock. He arrived right on time every single day. He sat down at his desk, and really without an observable break, and my office was right across from the bathroom, so I could observe breaks. Duke just worked. He sat there, he worked longhand. I never saw him in his entire career touch anything other than that old-fashioned black telephone wired in. I know that he never had an iPad, even in retirement, nor an iPhone, and when I visited him at his home, he still had that same telephone set up there. During the season known as grading, when many of us would disperse to our various private corners of misery and just sit there over those exams, 84 people telling you over and over what the answer is to one particular same question, Duke still came to the office. He sat there hour after hour without any complaint, just ticking off the exams as he read them and the points he was awarding on the grid system. Most of you who had Duke, all of you who had Duke, had that grid system. Jack, I know you remember it for sure. He passed it on to me, and I used it for years and years and years with enormous student complaint. Duke was impervious to student complaints. He continued with that grid system. They hated it. He didn't care. He just did it. I myself folded, and I have a kind of a camouflaged version in the last 10 years. And that's indicative of how Duke stamped most of us here. He showed us how he did it, and then we followed suit and then began to make a few changes. I remember when I decided to divide the civil procedure class into 2 sections. And of course I didn't check with Duke, I just made that happen. But Duke heard about it and appeared right away in my office. What is this about? He wanted to know. And I said, well, I think it's more comfortable for students to have a smaller group. And that way they can participate more freely. It's just a little intimidating with those 75 students that we had then. And then they can ask questions and make comments in just a smaller group. And Duke looked at me and he said, why would you want them to ask questions? When I began to incorporate Indian law into civil procedure, I just didn't discuss that at all with Duke. But he was a huge supporter of me and everybody as they came in. And I think that the evidence course is really the best way to look at that influence. When I did take over evidence and really began to study the Montana Commission comments, I could see the huge role that Duke himself had had on that commission, working with many of you who were also on that commission, and his approach, which was, yes, we'll use the federal rules of evidence as a model, but you know what, they're not the boss of us. They're in DC. They don't know how things work in Montana, and they screw some things up and we don't have to follow suit. So for instance, the federal rules of evidence, which have a quite long section on Rule 609, Judge, as you know, the admission of prior criminal convictions. It's divided up into what kind of conviction it was and how long ago it was and whether it has to do with truth and honesty or something else, whatever. It's very long and it's complex. We don't have that in Montana, and that's largely because of Duke. We have one sentence, which I can't quote verbatim, although I'm sure Duke could, but the sentence is, prior criminal convictions are not admissible in any court proceeding for any reason, period, full stop, end of story. So Duke looked at the national law, and then he decided, in consultation with all of his colleagues, whether or not it made sense for Montana. And if it didn't make sense to him for Montana, he made sure that our rule reflected what was right for Montana. So he had a clear opinion, and he stuck to it. And that public service to the bar and to Montana was amazing. Even if you were not a lawyer, the effect that he had on the Montana law means that your life has been influenced by and better improved by the work of Duke Crowley. Duke would claim to be embarrassed by this fuss about him. He would think there was nothing really to talk about, he just did his job. And for sure, he had nothing to do with an utter disrespect for college athletics. He did not care. He thought the Grizz-Cat rivalry was stupid, and I would have to say he would look out and say, what's all this maroon doing in this room? But I know that he was enormously proud of everybody, every single person whom he's taught, and all of the colleagues with whom he worked on the faculty, but more particularly in government and at the bar. And he would be secretly pleased to see us all gathered here today. Thank you for being here. And Duke Crowley, thank you for all you mean to all of us.
Thank you, Cynthia. Duke had a name for students who complained. He called them mopes. It was probably the worst thing he could say about you. But he also introduced us to the concept that if rustlers steal calves and then a cowboy takes the stand to testify that when the calf was returned from the rustlers and mothered up to the home rancher's cow, that cowboy was engaging in hearsay, or the issue, because the cowboy was saying in court what the calf had told him. Mallory Ottariano is providing music. Judge Ed McLean was raised in Anaconda and graduated from the University of Montana School of Law in 1973. He was a career prosecutor before taking the bench in 1989, establishing himself as an excellent trial judge over the next 26 years. He was a lifelong friend of Duke and a former student of Duke Crowley's, and could match him story for story. The Honorable Ed McLean.
Thank you, Dean. Judge Haddon, Betty. Folks, I come before you today to tell you a few stories about the Duke, and in doing so, I do not presume to be any closer to him than the rest of you, nor as close as some of you. But I'd like to just reminisce about him out of my respect for this great man and his wife Elaine, who opened their house for me when I was younger and was more or less a mentor and a sounding board for me when I was young and starting out. And involved in that is a few stories. I always like to think that I brought Duke religion to his life, as when we used to have a few beers downtown and I would do something to create a little misfortune, he would say, Jesus Christ, Ed. Holy Christ, McLean. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. And then, as things got older, and they weaned me from that substance called beer, we got into quite some lengthy discussions about law and the practice. And I always used to like to enlighten Duke by telling him that my brother Tim married a girl from Butte and O'Brien. He moved from Anaconda to Butte and raised IQ both towns. And Duke had the good sense to marry a Husted from Anaconda and elevate their household. Needless to say, he had plenty of responses. And the advantage of sending Duke to university is he went from Yabba to interesting, but have you given any thought to it? And I was always amazed at how he made that transformation. Because when I started out, a couple times, Lois Williams at that time was a court reporter, and she would stop in the middle of proceedings. She says, stop it, stop it. And I was given a presentation to the jury. I says, what? She says, this machine will not take down those words. You have to speak English. And Luke and I would laugh and have discussions about that. And he would tell me about his transformation from Butte. And every once in a while would lapse back into some of those things, which you can't repeat here and there. And Duke liked to say that he never hated anybody, but he had intense dislike for a few people. Duke was one of what we know, in the words of Tom Brokar, as the greatest generation. And probably the best example in the world of what the GI Bill has accomplished for America. When you take a look at his background and humble beginnings, and the last of that great generation, you've given the education, and how many of us in this room owe so much to him. Our generation, I was born in '46, our generation was the first generation that got to own their own basketball, that got have their own pipe. And for us from the blue collar and the middle class, that greatest generation opened up to us not only professors like Duke Crowley, but the possibility of getting a college education. And I look at this kid that was born in 1923, went to work within the mines, then off to the service, obtained the GI Bill, then to college. And if there's one thing you don't associate Duke Crowley with, it's getting a master's degree in law and taxation. We talked a lot over the years, but we never talked about taxation. We talked about evidence, we talked about civil procedure. One of Duke's pet peeves when they moved from the old rules of procedure to the new ones is he thought we should have a law that the first 20 or so lawyers that made an objection to being incompetent, irrelevant, and immaterial should be taken out and shot in public. And we bring it into that process. And so it was with Duke when he worked for the government, Forrest Anderson, Tom Judgment. He worried about what is the common sense approach and how to articulate it so we make access to justice make sense to the lay people in our community. And when I would go over and sit and visit at his house and discuss things, those are the type of things we would discuss and what sort of problems as a young judge you ran into. And a helping, guiding hand, but never in a telling way that he was saying you should do this or you should do that. It's what are your options? You're the judge. You make the choice where you're going. But here are the different things. And the thing I miss about Duke the most, in his later years, you got the benefit of hearing the same thing every 5 minutes as he was starting down the path towards his maker. But the thing that I miss the most is the way he would discuss the problem in a philosophical manner and the alternatives that were available to us. Not only was Duke a very intelligent man, he had his match in his wife. And talk about two independent thinkers, you know, and the way they handle it just amazes me. I wish my wife had the patience that Elaine has. You know, the legend of Duke will circulate through the practice of law, but his legacy, his really true legacy, is sitting in this room and across the cities and counties of Montana in the professionalism and the way we behave, not only in the courtroom but in the pleadings. I have to see a lot of attorneys come in from out of state and practice law, and I can tell you this, Montana takes a backseat to absolutely no one. And the professionalism I see at the bar is at a level that is not surpassed anywhere. There's courteousness, and there's people that file their pleadings, file their memorandums, and give their argument to a court, and afterwards go have lunch together and are civil together. And the discourse and the learning experience for a judge is amazing. If there's one thing that Duke Crowley taught me and that I'll leave you with, is the most intelligent people in the courtroom is not the person behind the bench. It's the people that have done all the research and prepared all the pleadings. And what they pay the judge the money for, in my opinion, is to be as objective as possible and to reach a decision on the intelligent materials that have been given to you. And if a person has that philosophy, I think that person will do well on the bench. I'll miss the guy, as will all you, and I'll thank them every day that I'm associated with the law. Thank you for having me, folks.
Thank you, Judge McLean. Duke talked about jurors. He said, sometimes you've got a really sharp guy. Sometimes you have a guy who moves his lips when he's reading. And sometimes you have a guy who moves his lips when he's looking at pictures. This is one of my favorites. If in your practice, any of you come across a criminal mastermind, call me Clark. He said, show me a man with a tattoo and I will show you a man who's been drunk at least once. Judge Gordon Bennett was a young graduate of Georgetown Law School. He was hired to work for Governor Forrest Anderson and his first assistant, Duke Crowley, because the governor liked Bennett's former background as a journalist. His career in federal and state government culminated in 17 years as judge in the 1st Judicial District in Helena, where he decided cases of major statewide impact. He remained friends with Duke Crowley throughout Duke's life. The Honorable Gordon Bennett.
Looking at this picture here, can you see the picture here? That's Duke trying to make a point. It's been said that Duke held court in room 35 in Helena, and that's true. But the best show in town in Helena was when Duke Crowley and a professor from Carroll College named Tom Clinch would get together and drink beer at Higgins' store across the street from the Plaster. I'd like to tell you a whole bunch of, give you a whole bunch of quotations from that time, but I have only been given 5 minutes here, and I also don't remember them. But I do remember that it was the best show in town. People would gather to hear Duke and Tom relive their time in Walkerville. And they had a kind of a genius, I think. Usually they got together on Friday nights down at Higgins's, and they both had an elephantine memory. And where memory didn't serve them, they were tremendously creative. And he bought very few drinks. Duke didn't like to buy drinks particularly. He liked to drink drinks, but he didn't like to buy drinks very often. And the people that came to that show at Higgins's bar or saloon never let him get thirsty. And so that's where he held out best, I think, and that's where some of his best stories were generated or repeated. And whether these wonderful sayings he had were developed. I thought you should know about that. And he did all this before he came over here to Missoula, and I understand he held court down at the Montana Club. Is that the name of the place?
Yep.
Some place downtown called Montana. He held court down there, and it was before he got to be a vegetarian, I guess. But the bartender, after Duke got to be a vegetarian and a naturalist and all kinds of offensive things, the bartender leaned over one day and said, "Duke, don't you kind of once in a while get hungry for something good to eat?" And that was what Duke remembered about his vegetarian thing. I want to talk about the symbiosis between Duke Crowley and Forrest Anderson, because I think that combination affected the government of Montana more than any other factor that's ever been addressed here in Montana. Was it a partnership? Was it a father and son thing? Was it a project where they got together and did things? No, it was a conspiracy. They operated wonderfully together in the Attorney General's office. I showed up in the Attorney General's office 2 days after Forrest Anderson became Attorney General. And at that time, 2 or 3 days after I got into the office, the Attorney General of Montana came in my office and threw a piece of paper on the desk and said, this is that Korean tax thing. I don't know whether you've heard about it or not, but there was a tax levy to pay a bonus to the Korean veterans. And he threw it on my desk and he said, they set this up and they want an opinion as to whether this is constitutional. So he said, write me up something on it, and he said, it's constitutional. And I didn't really want to challenge, in my third day in office, I didn't want to challenge the Attorney General about his opinion. So I went to Duke and said, I'm supposed to write an opinion about this, and Forrest says it's constitutional. How does he know that? Well, Duke said, one or two of the members of the Supreme Court are vets. One is up for election next year. One thinks cigarettes should be taxed out of existence, and one of them follows the others. It's constitutional. He said, your job is to tell us why. That's kind of how they work. He wasn't really an interpreter, but he was an extender. When the governor, Forrest Anderson, the Attorney General, had something he wanted done, he thought about it himself, he designed it, he provided leadership, but as far as getting it done was concerned, his number one guy, as far as I know, was Duke Crowley. And that went on for quite a while, and I want to give you some examples of how that worked. For the Fish and Game Commission, the Fish and Game Commission is a terror for any governor. There are, at least, as Forrest used to say, 200,000 experts on fish and game in Montana. And all of them know how to run the commission. And you can't be right about anything. So Duke went to work after they got in the governor's office. And they worked for days figuring out where they could get, I think, 5 impeccable people that nobody could touch. There was a priest amongst them. And with that, they never had any trouble with the Fish and Game Commission. And the 200,000 experts thought he was a pretty good expert himself. On corrections, they worked together, but they weren't together. Duke wanted to put them all in jail, and Forrest wanted to rehabilitate them. And Duke wasn't quite sure anybody could be rehabilitated after they got into court and committed crimes and so on. He wasn't in love with them at all, and I think the people that took criminal law from him probably got that impression. But we had a lot of trouble over at the state prison while I was in the office. I worked at it. While these two people kind of disagreed about what you do with offenders, they worked together so that the system was improved greatly. They took the prison out of the hands of a warden who was a sheepherder, and they got a real expert and they began what is the rehabilitation program that exists over at the prison. They worked together on that, and they hardly ever agreed what was the right thing to do, but they could quickly agree when they had to do it, and they did it. When the Constitution question came up, the 1972 Constitution, this was after he became governor. Question is, what should a governor do with a constitutional convention? That was a very, very big, important problem. They decided what, and I say advisedly, Duke was still talking to Forrest over the phone. I think he was teaching at that time, that I can tell you that the reflection of Duke was there all of the time. They decided that they'd stay out of it as far as the public was concerned. They would give all of the assistance they could to the convention, but not get into it. Because if they got into it, then it became political. And Leo Grable and John Harris, and so on, some other people, amongst other things, decided, I don't know whether they decided it or whether Duke and Forrest decided it, but to seat the members of the delegation by their letter, by their names, not by their parties. And that was the secret of the success of the Constitution we have now. And I'm pretty sure that was thought up in the governor's office, but it might not have been, I don't know. And then it got to be time, and this is speculative, but they got to be time, as has been mentioned, to sign the Constitution. And Forrest Anderson signed the Constitution quite willingly. He helped many, many times the people working with it. Duke and counsel provided valuable counsel to the Constitution, particularly in criminal matters. But as has been mentioned, Secretary of State Murray, when Forrest had signed the Constitution, wanted Murray to notarize it as is required. And Secretary Murray didn't like the Constitution. He liked the old Constitution. But he was, to the end, he was sort of opposed to it, and he said, well, I didn't see you sign this. And I don't know what happened exactly. I wasn't there, but I can hear Duke Crowley saying in Forrest here, sign it again. And they did. The Constitution of Montana this day has 2 signatures of Forrest Anderson. That kind of cooperation. On reorganization, and then there was the state fund business. Duke went way back in the Attorney General's days. Duke and Forrest didn't like the idea that they thought they saw, that the auditors served 1 or 2 sessions, or 1 or 2 terms, and then they retired, and they retired quite well. And I suppose Duke got to thinking about that. Why did they retire so well? Well, the 2 of them got together. This is way back when Forrest was the Attorney General and Duke was the first assistant. They got together and they said, well, it could be the way the system works. That is, all the state's money goes into the banks. And the banks sit on that money and they get interest, a lot of interest. millions of dollars worth of interest. And so they decided to do something about that. And so a bill went through the legislature. This is many years later. A bill went through the legislature, and it had gone through both houses, and it was heading toward the governor's office, and a desperate lobbyist from the banking organization called up and started shouting at the governor about what they were doing down there. And Forrest's answer, I get this from the guy that received the answer, Forrest said, "They did?" Whereupon, bill went through, was signed, and it's saved hundreds of millions of dollars for the taxpayers of Montana and given them control over their own money. But that was just the inspiration of two guys sitting around the Attorney General's office wondering why the auditor made out so well. On the reorganization of the government, I think credit should be given to Forrest's brother-in-law, Jack Prosser, who is the budget director, and George Boswellman, but principally, I think, Duke Crowley. Duke was talking about reorganization of the government 9 years before it happened. And he and Forrest were together on it. They worked together on it. And they reorganized the state government, as you heard. Made it so that you could do something, the governor could have some power. And then they remembered back, nobody could forget how things used to be before Forrest, the Anderson-Crowley administration. They remembered back to the Daley and Clark days when they fought about where the capital of Montana should be. And after a great deal of bourgeois, in 1895, where they decided the capital would be in Helena. And Duke Crowley and Forrest Anderson decided the capital wasn't there. It was in the 6th floor of the Hennessy building in Butte. And so, quietly, without very much of anybody noticing it, during the 4 years that Forrest was governor, the capital moved from Butte to Helena, finally. So, they worked together, concert, for probably, it's hard to say when Duke quit working in the governor's office, but I have an idea that it ended about the judge's administration. For many, many years, 12 years at least, it was a partnership. It was a conspiracy for good government. And the only analogy I've ever been able to figure out is it comes from the pool games that Minnesota Fats used to carry on. Minnesota Fats would set up a pool game for money, and he'd blow a couple of games, and the other side would be betting more money. But by the time he got him up there, then he showed his real height and could sink every ball except one, the 8 ball. And Forrest Anderson and Duke Crowley could sink every shot except for the 8 ball in the corner pocket.
Thank you, Judge Bennett. Duke said of Ekalaka, it's not the end of the earth, but you can see it from there. He said of journalism, and Judge Gordon Bennett, the former journalist, will appreciate that. It's back fence gossip through a bullhorn. He said of railroad litigation in Montana, the railroad always hits the best cow in the herd. Ammons is a 2001 JD graduate at the University of Montana Law School. She had a career in nursing, raised family. For 29 years, she lived next door. It was Professor Crowley's neighbor, remained Professor Crowley's neighbor. She's in private practice now in Missoula, and she has brought today some pictures and some reminiscences about family life with the Crowleys. Robin?
Duke was a neighbor that would always stop and talk. How are you? How's your family? He would talk about his family since well before he was born, as if it all happened yesterday. Growing up, there was one attorney that Duke took example from, and that was his grandfather, Matt Canning. Not some old grandfather leaning back in his chair, reminiscing about the good old days, but a guy with a lot of guts. He was why Duke went into law in the first place. This is a memorial for Duke Crowley, but in order to understand Duke, you have to know something about the legacy of his grandfather. At 15 years old, Matt Canning was destined to be a Catholic priest in Ireland, his mother's plan. But 7 years into the seminary and just shy of ordination, he had a point of decision, as Duke would say. He ditched the priesthood, ran away to America with a young Irish lassie, Mina Hughes. Matt was 22 and Mina was 19. They arrived in Butte flat broke, and Matt started working as a miner. They lived in boarding houses and got married and had a daughter, Duke's mother, Linda. Matt studied law and was admitted into the bar in 1903. This is a 1908 directory, and you can look right here, and it shows that Matt partnered with Burton K. Wheeler, later a 3-time U.S. Senator. In 1914, Matt ran for county attorney in Butte and won. At this point, he had tried 37 murder cases. Around the state, Matt was known as that big Butte attorney. He's got a left. He was against public hangings and hangings in general, but he was very much for freedom of speech. In 1918, Matt represented a Montana Montana farmer named Bess Hall. Hall was charged with espionage for criticizing the American efforts in World War I. The case went to trial in Helena, and Matt won, and the public was enraged. After trial, Matt heard that people were looking for him, but he wasn't intimidated. In fact, he started looking for them. He stepped into the Placer Hotel bar and demanded into the crowd, "Is there someone looking for me?" The deputy sheriff punched him, and Canning was escorted out by a U.S. Marshal who advised him that the crowd fully intended to finish him. Outside, Canning shook him off and returned to the bar from another door because he wasn't going to back down. He was stopped by a U.S. Marshal who said, "There's not one looking for you, Matt. There are a dozen looking for you." And he convinced him to leave. The Bess Hall case prompted the sedition law in Montana, making it illegal for the government or to criticize the government during wartime. 47 people went to prison. In 1926, Matt passed away at 54 years old, and Duke was almost 4 years old. And Matt Canning's funeral was Duke's first memory in his life. Life was different when Duke was growing up. Between the Anaconda Company and the Depression, it got a lot worse. Duke was a coal miner's son in Walkerville, and this is the house he grew up in. Even though he had passed away, Duke's grandfather became his touchstone. In Duke's home was Matt Canning's roll-top desk, where Duke kept his books and pencils. And Matt's beaver skin coat wrapped him in on winter nights. In high school, Duke called himself a street kid and hung around the corner park in Maine, talking with his buddies and arguing. And one kid was once asked, "Why do you come here?" And the kid's response was, "To listen to Duke argue." After high school, Duke worked in the mines. One day, a foreman told him, "Crowley, take this report to the 6th floor." And the 6th floor in the Hennessy building was the headquarters for the Anaconda Company. When he stepped into the elevator, Duke told the operator very officiously, "6th floor." People were dressed in suits and vests, and the superintendent of mines greeted him and said, "So you're Matt Canning's grandson." The first case Duke ever argued before the Supreme Court was a tax case worth $3 million. Opposing counsel was Jeanette Rankin's brother, Wellington Rankin. The justices raked Duke over the coals, and he answered all their questions. And afterward, Duke spoke to the justices and he said, "I had to ask, why were you so hard on me?" And the answer was, "You're Matt Canning's grandson. We wanted to see what you're made of." Duke won the appeal. For years, Duke had his eye on the Sedition Act, and he researched it, and he knew what had happened. When he was on the commission to revise the state's criminal law, he said, "I made it my business to repeal that law." In a delicious irony of 1973, the man who led the effort to repeal the Sedition Act was the grandson of the lawyer whose case had prompted the law in the first place. This is why I stayed out of here. The guys in the Placer Hotel bar wanted to finish Matt Canning, but Duke got to finish the whole show. Here they are, two great men, a grandfather and his grandson, who left a great mark on Montana law. And that's it. And actually, I did want to say one other thing. There were lots of connections in the neighborhood, having Duke as a neighbor, and there are several neighbors here today, and I think there are several Lambroses, although I can't see them. Okay, there we go. And one of the cool things that we learned about Duke's grandfather was that he helped the Lambros' grandfather, George's father, back in the day, and he helped George's father keep his brother out of World War I. So it's, having Duke as a neighbor was like this huge historical resource. So it's been a pleasure.
So, Duke always was a source of history, politics, law for all of us, mentors to so many of us. We thank you for coming this morning for this, I suppose, final lesson from Professor Duke Crowley in all those matters. It's wonderful to look out and see all the faces in here, and I can recognize how you were affected as a student, or friend, or colleague, or housekeeper. And it's wonderful that you came here today to participate in this. Thank you very much. At 1 o'clock today, we are having a get-together lunch and a tailgate party for the Bobcat Grizzly game. I hope you can all be there. We look forward to seeing you, and have a good weekend. You're welcome to stay and talk. Thank you.